Look at the research and analysis into the circular economy. Almost all of it focuses on the developed, industrialized Western nations. So what happens if you take that circular economy framework and try to apply it in a different context? That's what our guest in this session has been doing in Chile, specifically in a region that was struck by a terrible earthquake in 2010. Bo Chang, our guest today, is a graduate student researcher who specializes in city and regional planning and in public health. Bo, thanks for joining us today. Bo,
good evening.
Could you tell us about the time that you've spent with the Regional Ministry of Housing and Urban Development in Chile?
Sure. So good evening, Colin, and everyone attending the DIF and watching it on playback. I spent this past summer of 2017 in a region of Chile called Cauca. It is in the 7th department, and it is approximately 3 hours outside of the capital, Santiago. Now, my work with the Regional Ministry of Housing and Urban Development was to look at ways of which they were tackling sustainability issues. As Colin mentioned, there was a terrible earthquake that struck in 2010, and a recent study of the downtown buildings still indicated that there are over 30% of the urban structures that are out of use due to that earthquake. So to give you an idea of what Cauca looks like, I'm gonna share a couple of photos with you all. So given that Cauca is the regional capital of this department, there are still very strong agricultural roots. As you see here, this is a gentleman coming into town using literally horses and his wagon to either carry his agricultural goods or to buy goods from the city to take back to where he lives.
Well, can I ask, how typical is that scene in Talca?
So yeah, I was just walking down the street on a Tuesday afternoon. This was after lunch. So it's fairly common. I had asked my coworkers about this, and they said, no, this is something that's fairly normal. It's not anything out of the ordinary.
Okay, so the picture is this is quite a poor region then.
It has a very interesting economy, even though it's the departmental capital. The average income of the person in Talca ranks as one of the, I believe, one of the lower quartiles of the country.
Okay.
So one of the major things that we were looking at is the recovery from earthquake, an earthquake in which you have houses that were almost a century old, completely devastated. There were empty lots. There were literally, I looked at one of the GIS maps, and it was somewhat like Swiss cheese, the amount of devastation and the buildings that were out of use. So we were looking at ways in which we can resuscitate and to plan for a downtown moving forward. And the idea of sustainability was very much on their minds. And this is part of my background in terms of studying my background in economics and also previously in China development studies. I had looked at sustainability for a long time and understood that there were some serious issues with it, which is when I decided to introduce the idea of the circular economy, which was something they were quite keen on. The people I was working with within the Department of Building and Construction, they wanted to learn more, and that is the time where I introduced the building and real estate portion of the toolkit of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's recently published Denmark case study for the circular economy for policymakers. So the section I was speaking to them on in particular was the construction and real estate opportunities. So it was broken down to three particular parts. The number one on the top left, the industrialized production and 3D printing of building modules. And number two, sharing and multi-purposing of buildings. And number three, reuse and high-value recycling of components and materials. So in introducing these three components, there was a lot of discovery in terms of some of the challenges it takes to implement a circular economy system in a place like Chile. So with the first part, the industrialized production and 3D printing of building modules, they were very up to speed in terms of the hardware. So for instance, Chile has some of the best disaster earthquake engineering in the world, just because they go through so much of it. So the department I was working with, they were quite proud to proclaim that it's them and Japan, it's Chile and Japan in terms of disaster and earthquake engineering. So when we talked about industrialized production and 3D printing, this is something that they would need to adapt in terms of their education for the engineering, because I'm sure you've all seen some of these newly 3D printed buildings where it's basically a machine arm that is squirting out concrete out of like a 3D program to construct a house. But how well do those houses stand up to an earthquake-prone environment, which is something that they would be interested in researching. Whereas the industrialized production portion, excuse me, of it, that is something that they're aware of, and they want to move in that direction as well. Chile is one of the most isolated countries in South America. The capital Santiago is easily a difficult place to import a lot of their goods, and they import quite a bit just because their agricultural sector is productive for half of the year, and they have a import of different foods and materials. So they do know that being able to produce building materials locally and modularly would offer them great savings. Now the second part, yes.
Sorry to interrupt, Bo. Did you get to any conclusions when it came to the application of 3D printing in earthquake-stricken zone?
I think there is a need for looking at the way the education is going to be incorporating 3D printing. So first of all, they have a very strong engineering departments within their school systems. Well, this is one thing that was interesting that came up to me over the summer, was that there was not a lack of hard skills, but rather the soft skills of implementing social reform as attached to some of the rebuilding of the areas. So, I mean, soft skills meaning, how do they consider equity? How do they consider affordable housing? How do they implement social programs in a way that isn't going to marginalize people or move people into far away areas? So I mentioned some of the buildings in the downtown area were destroyed. They ended up constructing some of these newer housing for disaster relief in an area that is disconnected from the downtown. They're not connected by transport, so it's more difficult for them to go to their places of work. So it's these kind of considerations that they really have to take into account. So when I brought up the idea of 3D printing buildings, their number one concern, making sure that these buildings are up to snuff in terms of standing up to earthquakes. And secondly, resolving some of the stickier stuff like land issues, and how to make sure that they are able to redevelop the downtown with minimal cost. So then the second part of the toolkit that we looked at was the sharing and multi-purposing of buildings. So this is an area that Talca, unfortunately, is still not a very dense place. The population is approximately over 200,000 people. And right now, the vast majority of the buildings in Talca is 1 to 2 stories tall. There are a few exceptions. There's a small concentrated downtown area. But when we spoke about sharing a multi-purposing of buildings, this is still not something that they're not particularly keen on. I think for one of the main reasons is that this requires a certain amount of floor space, available commercial floor space that they haven't fully built out yet. And they're really struggling to identify the way in which they want to move forward. So there is one camp in politically that that want to develop. Excuse me.
Well, I'll tell you what. While Bo's sorting himself out with a refreshing glass of orange juice, let me just tell the viewers who are watching this at home that please put your questions into us using the comments section on the page you're watching this in, or if you're watching it something weird like Google Hangouts, then there's a chat box down the side. Equally, you can send us your comments on Twitter. Use hashtag ThinkDiff, and we'll make sure that your thoughts and comments go to Bo. Looks like you've recovered, Bo. Back to you.
Yeah, so there's 2 camps, and this is how people struggle with the direction of the urban development. One camp is to go in a fairly European route to densify the downtown area. There was a recent proposal and implementation of a pedestrian walk-in area of downtown Talca, which, I spending a month there. It was a fantastic place. There was a lot of life, bustling, kind of an area where people are out on the street and they're going to shops, and it was very European in terms of how it felt. And then there is another direction in which people would like to expand and create areas of suburbs where people want detached homes with a parking garage. So this is a very big tension here, because with lower density, then you create additional car dependence. So this is kind of at the root of the second component of the toolkit, whether or not there is enough density of the kind of space that would allow for sharing and multi-purposing of the buildings. And I think in terms of rebuilding a city, there are concerns that if it becomes too dense when the next earthquake hits, what will happen? But at the same time, there is you want to make sure that there isn't hardening of the pathway. If they become a suburban type of model, then it'll be very difficult to re-densify in the future. Oh, I think there is a question.
A question has come in. Yeah, I'll read it out for the audience's sake. A Chilean here. What do you think is better for social housing construction, 3D printing or precast concrete construction?
Oh, that's a great question. And I think this will actually lead into the third part of the toolkit that we'll talk about. But to answer your question directly, JM Chapa, I think, the way of balancing cost and quality is extremely important. Concrete is not a very energy efficient material and not a reclaimable material, unfortunately. So one of the examples that I've seen in terms of using reclaimable materials, let me share this image. Is the construction of half houses. These are award-winning housing structures by Alejandro Alverena. And this is housing rebuilt in Constitucion after the tsunami that struck after the earthquake. And they use wood paneling in this area to rebuild the homes. The physical building of these homes was done pretty quickly. Was that image shared, Colin?
I can't see it, Bo. No, I thought you were still fiddling to get it up. Can you tell us what's unique about the type of housing that you're promoting there.
Okay, so is the image up now?
Yeah, we see it now.
So these are half homes designed by the architect Alejandro Averena. And what's interesting about these homes is that in terms of construction, they were created fairly quickly after the devastation of the tsunami that struck after the earthquake in 2010. And they are built as half homes with the option for the family to expand should the need arise. And this is award-winning because it allowed for a fairly low cost for the government to create disaster housing, basically, for displaced families after the tsunami. and this uses wood, which is an issue that when I had spoken to ministry officials, currently there's a belief in Chile that construction out of concrete and other stone-based materials are somehow more secure. And this is, high quality wood construction is all over California. So I also live in an earthquake prone part of the world, and almost a large number of the houses here constructed are of wood, and that is because they withstand, the way that it's constructed, it withstands earthquake better. Although, the newer construction of the glass and concrete buildings, they have engineering ratings that could withstand very powerful earthquakes.
So can we come into materials in just a second? But a question came in from Sophia, who wants to see that picture again. I think it would be quite useful if you could put up the half house.
Half house, okay.
And her question was, when you call it a half house, is it literally they construct? Let me click this button here. They've constructed the part on the left, the reddish fronted part, and if so desired, they can construct the part on the right as well.
That is correct, Sophia. The houses, and I drove into this neighborhood, and there were entire blocks of these homes where they are connected side to side, and the government builds the red half that you see, and directly next to it, you see there is a gray half of the adjacent house. And that is for when a family is ready to expand either second floor or the first floor, and they could build out over into the space that they have.
Fascinating idea. Yeah, I love the thought of that, being able to expand your home without having to move away, perhaps from a neighborhood that you appreciate for all sorts of reasons.
Absolutely. I think the social connections and the need to maintain community is one of the most important things when it comes to disaster relief, right? I mean, you have a complete disruption in your life, either from an earthquake or a wildfire or any kind of natural disaster. And one of the most important things in terms of coming back is to make sure you still have your social network and to still have your community to really get you back on your feet. And one of the more innovative things that Chile has done with affordable housing is that depending on the family's economic income level, they are granted a subsidized cost for the housing. And after 5 years, these houses are no longer considered affordable, and the complete ownership is transferred to the family, and they could sell it at a market rate if they want. So that gives them the capital they need to move up in the economic ladder or whatever it may be.
And back to that point about materials, you'd started talking about how there are people in Chile who believe that I think you said a solid wood or concrete is viewed as more trustworthy in an earthquake zone. You also then said, correct me if I'm wrong, there's new types of buildings that are mostly made of glass, which can withstand earthquakes a lot better than I don't know, the sort of concrete homes, I guess you were comparing it to. What next then for Tulca or Chile in general? What do you recommend they construct their homes with?
Honestly, I think, looking at what's happened with some of the buildings in Tulca, this is an example of the Central Market, which is approximately a century old. It withstood the earthquake, but you can see that there's extensive damage to the outer infrastructure. And this is going to cost tens of millions of dollars to refurbish. And this is an earthquake that happened 7 years ago. So this building, this Central Market, which is very important to a vibrant downtown life where people not only go to buy their goods, but also to sell their goods, it's been out of commission for 7 years. And it's going to take at least another 3 to 5 years for this building to be rehabilitated. For that reason, I think that to have, and this is the third part of the toolkit, to start building with materials that are reclaimable and that are high quality is really important. And I do believe that, as unpopular as wood may be in some contexts, I think this might be the right fit for Chile. They have a very strong resource in terms of the forestry that's available within the country. So this is something that, if they do it correctly, it could be a way to really get some of the areas affected by disasters back on their feet.
So you say
this requires like serious to destigmatize certain materials like wood, to make sure that this becomes an acceptable material to be used.
So wood is a stigma in terms of what it's a yesteryear type material to build homes with? Is that the stigma you're referring to?
The stigma is just that people think that it's less sturdy. People think that it is cheaper and therefore worse. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily more efficient, or it could be done in a high quality way, which is interesting because the most southern region of Chile, where the colonial legacy is, there's like a German town there, and there they have done wood construction. So you actually see some of the housing that kind of look like the Alps, or kind of look like parts of Europe that use like high quality wood construction. So, the seeds are there, so to speak. The possibility exists for them to use this as an example for future construction.
And the recoverable point, I guess, is crucial, right? Because we opened this up by talking about applying a circular economy in an earthquake zone like Chile. So tell us why wood is the best fit, in your mind, it sounds like, for a circular economy.
Sure. So, the point of the circular economy is that nothing is wasted, right? That even waste is a resource. And, looking at the way people live their lives in buildings, the way they're used, gone are the days where people stay there for 100 years. It may be the case where a city needs to be configured and reconfigured to accept new populations, to adapt to new uses. And so with high quality modular wood construction, buildings can be assembled and disassembled so that they could be reused, either put into a new place, or to be, if they're correctly modularly made, they could be redone to suit other purposes. And so that's the drawback with concrete. Once you have a concrete podium and a building that's set in place, it'll be there for a long time, or at least until the next earthquake strikes. But once that is done, there's not much that you could do with it afterwards. And it's extremely highly energy intensive, both in its construction and deconstruction.
Mm. And I mean, you've partly answered one of the questions that just come in from Bass there. who is talking about the half house and rebuilding after disaster. This is, I guess, the big point I'm taking from Bass's question. When rebuilding after a disaster, is modularity something that's taken into account? Is it easier to work with those materials if the market hall in this case has been destroyed by earthquake?
Yeah, like I said, the whole construction of that home, something that one praised is how fast it's implemented. Oh, somebody's muted.
Oops, I'm muted. Sorry about that. I'm a bit of a novice here. Okay, another question is coming from JM Chapa, asking, who do you think should lead the transition to new tech? Architects, engineers, government, or real estate developers?
That's a great question from JM Chapa. I think we could really use, this is where we want the public-private partnership to come in. You know, historically, Chile has had a complicated history with a dictatorship back a few decades ago. And so, you know, if anything is led solely by just the private sector, just the government, you're going to have people that will be suspicious of it. I think this is a great opportunity for modular homemakers, for building companies to come in and cooperate with the government and really start by working with the existing engineers, working with the existing government professionals to perhaps conduct tests to show the public that modular wood housing or modular housing from reclaimable materials can stand up to the test of earthquake design. And if they don't, they have an amazing opportunity to work with the engineers to design modular buildings that could withstand some of the challenges that Chile faces. So there's definitely an opportunity for a back and forth here, not only for a advanced modular construction company to come in to do business, but to also learn from the local experience to make modular housing that could withstand earthquakes and other natural disasters.
Okay, Bo. I do have one final question I'd like to ask you, but I'm not certain you've told us everything you want to tell us yet.
I've covered most of my experience. I mean, I could definitely spend another hour or so talking about some of the political nuances and the other things that I've gone through. I mean, like the food there was another story altogether. But in terms of our topic for the DIF, I think I've covered everything that I can.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Bo. I'm going to ask you that final question in that case. As you've returned to California to continue your graduate student research work, what do you take from your experience in Chile that you can apply in California or going forward in your career?
Oh, wow. The issue is probably political continuity. The political environment is just so important right now. It's, you know, this is a lesson I've learned in my time that I spent in China. It's often not the hardware, it's the software, so to speak. The technology and the things that we do on a physical level is fairly simple in terms of implementing things and measuring their performances and whatnot. But it's really the software, right? The political environment, how we are conducting the way we do business. When I was there, the minister of the housing and urban development, I asked him what was his priority in terms of rebuilding these devastated areas. And he said, well, sustainability to me means social equity. And that was amazing. That was, you know, I've never heard the head of a ministry speak on those levels, that first and foremost, the way we are reconstructing our cities, the way we are moving forward in the development of our urban spaces need to be led with social equity. And that was great. My manager that I worked with, he bought into the vision. But he said that, oh, this is a minister that is put in charge by the current government party. And there is an election taking place this month in Chile for their new president. And they said, who knows how things are going to change once a new political party arrives, which they think will happen. So I'm actually staying tuned to seeing what's going to happen this month on top of my studies. And I definitely wish them all the best, because this is an exciting time with a great opportunity to have a place outside of Western Europe try to implement some circular economy principles.
Okay, so fingers crossed that your favorite government minister is still in a job in 2 months' time.
Yes, indeed.
Well, thank you very much for giving us your time in this Californian morning for you and the evening for us here in the UK. Really appreciate this talk about some of the difficulties in implementing a circular economy in a quite different context, particularly given the earthquake, the likelihood of earthquakes in Chile. Let me just tell you before we disappear that the Disruptive Innovation Festival never sleeps. It's 24 hours a day and runs for 3 weeks. This is us ending week 2 now at the Disruptive Innovation Festival. And anything you've missed up to this point, well, here's the thing, you haven't missed it, because it's still available for you to watch on demand. Just go to the thinkdif.co website, look through the schedule, find something you fancy, and you can watch it back whenever you fancy. But there's a session coming up in 30 minutes time that has some relation to what Bo's been talking to us about. It's coming up in our live studio, and it features Google. The session's called How Google Sees Circularity and Human Health Working Together in the Built Environment. Sounds like some crossover between this session and Bo's. So maybe look out for that one. And from me, Colin Webster, I'm going to say good night and thanks for watching. Goodbye.